Hi, team. We're going to continue our conversation about immigration now, moving towards the policies that often shape migration. Just like pro and antinatalist policies encourage and discourage fertility, there are also similar policies made by governments to encourage and discourage migration. So our central question, I'm sorry, this is a little bit difficult to see here, are what policies do governments construct to encourage and discourage migration? To back it up a little bit here, what we're first going to begin with is that migration, that in general, there's several things that have historically prevented migration. These are called intervening obstacles. And in the past, intervening obstacles were primarily physical obstacles, parts of the natural environment. So we're talking mountains, oceans, rivers. Those things would often prevent people and function as boundaries. In modern day, those physical boundaries, of course, still remain, but governments often construct very deliberate and specific policies to limit migration. So we're first going to talk about the policies that discourage, and we're going to weave in our discussion about encouraging migration. An example of those historical boundaries and modern physical boundaries would be here in China. We studied this when we studied the development of China in world history, that we see the Himalaya Mountains, the Gobi Desert, the plateaus in the west, all function as, and the deserts in the west, all function as natural boundaries that prevent immigration, thus leading to the isolation of China for many years. So that's the historical setup for what these immigration policies are. So let's start at first by looking at the history of immigration policies in the United States. Initially, there was unrestricted migration. There was no formal policy that was going to be restricting or preventing migration. That, of course, did not necessarily mean that all groups were accepted and all groups were treated with equality and welcomed into the United States. In fact, sadly, the history of immigration policy of the United States has been largely a history of xenophobia, when they're fearful of people unlike you, and unkind and unwelcoming to different groups of people. And unfortunately, that began when really one of the first major immigration policies was the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, which barred immigrants from China from coming to the United States, which was based upon a stated fact of there being a threat from Chinese laborers coming, but the reality is this was just based upon the prejudice and just the prejudice against Chinese immigrants at the time. This was actually expanded in 1917. It was an act that prevented, or the 1917 Immigration Act prevented all kinds of what we would now consider very not politically correct terminology, people who were not literate, people who had mental illness, people who were criminals or predisposed to criminality, whatever that's supposed to mean. And one of the really controversial clauses of this was that there's a component of the act called the Asiatic Barred Zone Act, and that Barred Zone Act meant that they expanded the areas in Asia from which people would not be allowed to immigrate. So again, we kind of see this expansion of these prejudiced beliefs. Sorry guys, my computer's acting up a little bit here. Okay. The first major policy, one of the first major federal policies was called the Quota Act of 1921. And what this did is it enacted quotas from specific places of the world. In other words, it placed a limit on the number of people who could come from a particular place. Specifically, the way this worked was it was designed to ensure that the immigrants were primarily coming from Europe, and more specifically Western Europe. Again, these are prejudicial beliefs that these people in some way, shape, or form are more entitled, more superior, whatever you want to fill in for that prejudice belief. But it favored people from Europe because it essentially said that 3%, no more than 3% of, or up to 3% of the population that was currently in the U.S., that's the percentage of people that could keep coming from that place. In other words, the people who were currently here had an advantage from their place of origin than others who were seeking to come. Bottom line, this was designed to make sure that immigrants are primarily coming from Europe, and that was really it lowered the number. In 1921, those quotas were lowered, and this specifically began to target the influx of people from Eastern European areas, from Southern and Eastern Europeans, so from Russia and Italy. These are all, again, prejudicial beliefs and concerns. Specifically with Russia, we're looking at the concern. People were worried that the spread of communism that was occurring during the Russian Revolution in Russia would then spread to the United States. This too expanded upon the exclusion of the Chinese. So we continue to see these prejudicial beliefs against the Chinese, and you can see that there, that political cartoon. Another interesting turn of events and a switch of events here was one of the policies that actually encouraged, very rare in U.S. history, but encouraged migration from Mexico to the United States. And this was actually called the Bracero Program, Bracero meaning strong arm program. And it occurred from 1942 to 1964 which was the midway through World War II through mid-60s, but primarily focused during the era of World War II. And this program was designed to encourage Mexican men to become temporary agricultural workers to fill the jobs that were being left vacant by the soldiers that were deployed in war. And what this marked is that this marked the beginning of that periodic movement of migrant workers between the U.S. and Mexico. Sadly, as is often the case, that for guest workers, temporary workers like this, the people were treated quite terribly. The conditions were very poor. This was really designed to benefit the companies that needed the money. It was not really at all a social welfare program, and that the men that were working these jobs were often working in quite difficult and unfair working conditions. But this is a sort of an interesting component of U.S. history, because very rarely is migration encouraged in the U.S. history. Primarily, it's been rooted on discouraging. In 1968, those country quotas were overturned in favor of hemispheric quotas. Excuse me, I shouldn't say quotes. Quotas. Those hemispheric quotas, if you divide the world, of course, in half laterally, then we're looking at, I should say, based on longitude, and we've got the eastern western hemisphere. But because most of the world lives in the eastern hemisphere, the quotas here, that this did not favor, this still did not encourage migration from many of the countries that people were most trying to get out of and come to the United States. So it's still advantageous policy for the Western European countries that fell into the Western Hemisphere. By 1978, 10 years later, the hemispheric quota, man, again, another typo, sorry guys, quota was changed to a global quota. So all the way up here in modern day now, we have a modern policy of no more than 620,000 people per year, with no more than 7% from one particular country. So that's sort of our general history of immigration policy, and that, of course, have shaped which people have come from which countries during which times. Let's take a look now at some of the other ways in which that places create these immigration policies. And one of those ways that encourages or discourages is not a federal legal, or this is not a legal policy, but this is still something that encourages and discourages migration, is the construction of physical boundaries. In the United States, we have the U.S.-Mexico fence, and that's a collection of barriers. It's not necessarily one continuous fence, but that's many different groups of people actually are currently advocating for the completion of that wall, and to be further fortified or further strengthened. There's also a similar example of that in the demilitarized zone, which is known as the DMZ, between North Korea and South Korea. The Korean Peninsula went to war, and so this would be considered a civil war at the time when they were all under the same rule. And at the conclusion of the war, the country was divided along the 38th parallel. You can see that line there in the bottom right-hand map. And there's now currently a buffer zone. That's the demilitarized zone is this buffer zone, and that is designed, of course, to prevent anyone from escaping the oppressive rule in North Korea down to South Korea. So that's another example of a boundary, a physical boundary that would discourage migration. Similarly, the construction of the Berlin Wall, so during after World War II and the beginning of the Cold War, Germany was divided up between communist and capitalist zones, and the United States and its allies of France and Britain constructed, where they all had different quarters of the city of Berlin, and eventually that reduced down to that the Soviet Union had East Berlin, and the allies of the British, the French, and the United States controlled West Berlin. And as sort of the symbol of the Cold War and the tensions between the countries, the Berlin Wall, which is a physical wall that you see here, was constructed to separate the two zones, and this remained in place until the fall of the Soviet Union in 1989. So this too would be an example of a physical boundary intended. I mean, there's so many different consequences from these physical boundaries. I mean, the culture is divided. You have in these instances, you have different government practices, and that's separating these two places. So very much a physical representation of a separation of these peoples. One policy that we could argue that formally encourages migration that several places follow is guest worker programs. And these are also known as time contract workers. And so these are people, this is policies that allow migrants to come to a country when there's a particular labor need. So the Bracero Program would be an example of this guest worker program. But it's assuming that the worker will go home to their place of origin once the labor need subsides. So once there's no longer subsides means reduces. So once the labor need is gone, the guest workers are intended to return home. So there's a time limit to how long they're welcome for. So these are short-term work visas. Quite often these are the policies that encourage the sending of remittances. Remittances is the money that migrants send back home. So guest worker programs can often be challenging, though, because naturally, as human beings, if we're accustomed to a new place, many people will want to stay, and guest workers are very rarely allotted that opportunity to stay. And moreover, guest workers can also be extremely vulnerable components of society since they are not citizens of the country that they are in. They're not entitled to many of the social services. They're not provided for in the ways that they would as citizens of the country. So guest workers often find themselves in very vulnerable positions, as do migrants who are both documented and undocumented migrants. One thing that's interesting, a different kind of policy that encourages and discourages in some senses, but encourages migration, is the policy of the European Union. So we haven't gotten to our political geography unit yet, but the European Union is a supranational organization, which means its authority is above that of a national government. There's all different groups, different countries that come together and give the European Union, power. So the organization gets its power from its member states. And the European Union is essentially an alliance, and that's an oversimplified term, but that'll function for now, between many of the countries of Europe. And that was a product of the fact that these countries realized that they needed to have much greater and deliberate effort at working together. Otherwise, they were destined to repeat the challenges of World War I and World War II. One of the components of modern day of the European Union, one of their component of this alliance is that, and it doesn't apply to all, but it applies to most of the European states, that the trade barriers would be reduced, and therefore there would be free movement of people and goods across the European Union. So when you're in France, for example, and if you travel to Belgium or the Netherlands or Luxembourg or Germany, you do not have to have a passport. There's the free movement, is free trade and open free movement of people and goods across these borders. And so the term there, and it's misspelled, the Scheigen, I'm sure I am mispronouncing that, so I'm going to apologize. If anyone has better grammar, German pronunciation, please feel free to correct me. But that's the term that refers to the free travel zone of the European states. There's no border control at the common borders. If you ever yourself travel to Europe, then when you travel from one EU state that's in the Schengen, then to another EU state, you do not have to show your passport because there's the free open movement of people across these borders. Now, this is a positive thing. It represents sort of unprecedented collaboration in these countries in modern day. But it also is contributing to some of the current global migrant crisis in Europe because many of the people who are emigrating from North Africa and the Middle East to come to Europe are utilizing this free movement of trade, and that's a wonderful thing for the people who are escaping these just unbelievable poverty and oppression. But it's also a challenge for the European Union because they have a massive influx of people and are in immediate need of resources to provide for them. So there we are. There's our analysis questions. Number 1, I'm expecting 4 to 5 sentences. It should be a pretty thorough response. If you can't find this hyperlink, just simply Google National Geographic immigration policies around the world, and the first link that come up is the article I'd like you to use. All right. Thanks, guys.